Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, most merciful and compassionate. Uh, Odd to start with that when we're talking about terrorism, but that's our subject for today, just to underline the fact that the terrorists understand nothing really about religion, because religion is all about compassion and mercy. So, what we want to address today, I call this short talk Terrorism, the Deeper Roots, is what is really going on here as the news outlets all seem to be concentrating on the outward superficial aspects, a sign of the times, no doubt. So, all we hear about in terrorism is these specific individuals and their networks and how we're going to deal with them, and we have to improve the intelligence, and we have to militarily attack them in Raqqa without trying to understand what's really going on here. This is somewhat, I use a medical analogy, it's somewhat like trying to deal with Ebola in Africa without understanding what the cause is, what the virus is, and what its vectors are for transmission. So we'll try briefly, this could be one whole semester course in history, to look at the roots of this phenomenon. And actually there are roots in both of these societies, both in the Islamic world and in the world of America and Western Europe as well. So let's start with the roots in the Islamic world. Most people have not had enough education in history, including Canadian students. We were never taught really in any depth about what happened in World War I, which is where it all starts. So in World War I, we have the British fighting in the eastern part of Europe, fighting the Turks and the Ottoman Empire, and eventually forming an alliance. This is the Sir Lawrence of Arabia phenomenon, forming an alliance with the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, the Wahhabis represent a part of the religion that some people even consider heretical, but the least we can say is it's a very dry, arid form, puritanical form of the religion, without much depth and without any spirituality. In fact, the Wahhabis, or Salafis as they're called, are totally against Sufism, which is the living embodiment of spirituality in Islam and has been almost from the very beginning. So we see by the Saudis taking over basically the Islamic world with the help initially of the British and then of their petrodollars, they have spread their version of religion, which is probably one of the least interesting versions, if not an outrightly heretical one, of the Islamic tradition. Now, the other thing to understand in Islam, actually in all religions, but we will talk about it specifically in Islam, is there are three main heretical forms of the religion. And the one that we are referring to here is known as the Khawarij. They were the original hardliners and the ones who killed Sayyidina Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And their tradition has continued throughout history, and now the form that it takes is this jihadist form of Salafi. So this is one of the three heresies within Islam. The other two are the Mutazilis, who use too much reason, and the Batinis, who only look to the inner way. But this is the opposite. This is only looking to the other way. What this does is it gives you a boring, uninspiring, deadening form of religion whose only outcome can be something like terrorism. because of the lack of satisfaction in the mystical practice. Now, the Turks, who were their predecessors, were actually very sensitive to mysticism and Sufism. Many of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire had Sufi consultants. Some of them were even Sufi muridin, disciples themselves. They had an open idea of what Islam was all about. They worked with people from all the religions and all the nations, and they represented a much more noble form of our tradition than the current Wahhabi Salafi lineage. From there, we will shift. So it's not for nothing that of the people who did 9/11, 17 or so were from Saudi. Just people who were just desperate, discouraged, alienated because of the lack of any inspiration, the lack of any inner life in their own spiritual tradition. Now we shift from there to Western Europe and America, particularly at this point in time, and we see another of the roots, another of the deep roots of this phenomenon called terrorism. Now, again, this could be the subject of several semesters of history, but let's say the phenomenon, just for practical purposes, started with the French Revolution in 1789. And since then, and the American Revolution was very close by, 1783, and we have the development of democracy and free enterprise capitalism and that whole ideology. The problem here is not so much the ideology as the reality. Many people, not only Muslims, but many people, as you can see if you look around in the Western world, are completely alienated and disaffected and have lost hope with this dream of this democratic capitalism that's going to bring us happiness. Instead, we look around and we see family conflict, and we see terrible stress at the workplace, and we see relationships breaking up, divorces, suicide attempts, drug addiction. This tradition has not lived up to its promises at all. On top of it, many people are aware, especially in the East, but also to some extent in the West, of the hypocrisy inherent. So we go to Washington and we see on the Supreme Court written in stone, equal justice for all. And we know that this is a lie when you need $450, $500 an hour for a competent lawyer in the United States. It's impossible to have equal justice for all. They talk about free market enterprise, but we know that the large companies, what Marx would have called the monopoly capitalists, and other people call multinational corporations, are controlling much of the economy and not letting the smaller enterprises enter, so that even the free market economy is not a reality. We add on to this the increasingly unequal distribution of wealth, and this creates an amazing amount of cynicism. So people in both the West and the East have lost hope, really, in the American dream, although the politicians keep insisting on it. Now, one of the interesting ironies here is that actually both roots have something in common. Both the Wahhabi root and the democratic ideal, which hasn't lived up to its promise, have the same root. And this root is called philosophical materialism. What does that mean? It means that this is the idea that somehow if you change the outer circumstances, so in the Saudi case, if you force people to practice their religion or create an Islamic state, and in the Western model, if you create wealth, then even if it's unequally distributed, then by that means you will improve people's internal state. This is the opposite, actually, of the Sunnah of the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, who worked on the inner state. And there are probably many people in the West also who have realized, I mean, the example that comes to mind first is the hippies, but that actually the internal state is not necessarily dependent on external circumstances. And there are people who are very wealthy and very successful who are very miserable. So essentially you have two currents, two roots that are both profoundly embedded in superficiality. And this superficiality is not working. It's leaving people disappointed, disillusioned, and desperate. And those are the major roots, inner roots of the terrorist phenomenon. Now, someone may well ask, what are the solutions? And I think that would be a subject for another session. But let's say, obviously, we should be working more from the inside out rather than from the outside in. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, salamun mursalin, walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin, al-Fatiha. We always begin and end in the name of Allah, in the name of God, because God is the inner. God is inside all of us, and all happiness comes from there. It doesn't come from the outer. Thank you very much, and speak to you soon.